see if Robert's out there.
Is that there?
Open that door.
Good Sunday morning. Good to see you out today. It's a beautiful sunshiny day. I'm glad you're here. We'll begin a word of prayer this morning. Dick Deacon, would you please lead us in prayer? This morning, we're going to look at a word that we're probably familiar with, at least in one verse of the Bible. That is the word begotten. If I were to ask you, where's that word used? What verse? You would think, well, John 3 and verse 16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. Whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Well, that's where it's used. That's where most people realize it. But it's used in other places as well. We'll look at this morning. But what got my interest maybe in this word a little bit, I came across a couple of versions. I was just reading, see how they would read on a certain verse. And the word begotten is left out. Now, John 3 and verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only Son. It leaves the word begotten out. Now, why would it do that? Why would some of these versions want to leave the word begotten out? Because it's in the original Greek and it's there. Why would they want to leave it out? Which I don't know. But we need to look at the meaning of it and how it's used in the Scriptures. But the word means, the Greek word is monogenes, and it's the only one of a kind, and unique. There's the meaning of the word. Now, we probably don't use the word begotten in everyday conversation. But we may use the only one, and we may use one of a kind, or that's very unique. We could very easily use those words in our everyday conversation. But the word begotten, we just don't use that much in conversation. But two verses here where we find it was pertaining to Christ, John 3 and verse 16, or we just quoted that one here. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And then down John 1 verse 14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld the glory. We beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So Jesus certainly was the only one of God, only begotten Son. He was one of a kind, and he was unique. All those words certainly would fit Christ. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But that's where the word begotten is going with here. Christ is the only one of his kind, unique. And we can understand that because, of course, he was that very thing. Now, knowing that about Christ, that he is begotten, is used elsewhere to describe another individual in the Bible. Before it comes up, anybody know who that would be? What one other individual is described as begotten. And you can compare the two because they're both one of a kind. They're both unique. They're both the only one that fits their situation. Adam? Well, Adam will be one of a kind. But the Scriptures call this one one of a kind, and that goes back to Abraham and Isaac, in particular Isaac. It's where the scriptures are using that. Like Hebrews 11:17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So Isaac is considered the only begotten son, just like Christ was the only begotten son. In Genesis 22 and verse 1, that's where it speaks of Abraham being tested. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here am I. Then he said, Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Here's Abraham offering his only begotten son. Here's God that's offered his only begotten son. There's a lot of similarities here as to what's going on about the begotten, the only begotten here. Well, first of all, if you look at verse 2 there, Genesis 22:2, on the screen, it said, Now take your son, your only son, Isaac. Well, Isaac's not Abraham's only son. At this point, he's not. Who was the other son? Ishmael was the other son. But Isaac is different from Ishmael in many ways, as we'll see here, different from him. So what makes Isaac begotten? What makes Isaac the only one, or one of the kind, or unique? Well, one, look at the age of Abraham. Whenever God told Abraham about Isaac coming, he said, I'm too old. And then unique about him would be his mother, Sarah. There was two things going on there with her. One, she was too old to bear a child. And second of all, she was barren in the first place. She couldn't have a child if she wanted to. So in order for Isaac to come on the scene, God has got to intervene in this. He's going to have to cause Sarah to be none-bearing and also cause the age not to be a factor against her. So God is working in this to bring Isaac around, and God was working in it to bring Christ around. Christ was unique. He came to this earth without an earthly father. He came to this earth from a mother was a virgin. Those two things are unique. You've got to have a father. And virgins don't, have children without a relationship. So there we see there's things here that are similar, how these two, Isaac and Jesus, are both begotten, how they're both unique. So there's the uniqueness standpoint of Isaac and uniqueness standpoint of Christ. As we go back to John 3, verse 16, there again, there's the begotten, how it is used in two places, John 3:16 and John 1 and verse 14. So they both arrived in this world in unusual ways. No one else has come about like them unless they had God's help in this. Both planned well ahead of time. Yeah, even before creation, I guess everybody was planned. So one of a kind. You have Christ. Another thing about Christ, God in the flesh. Who else came like that? Nobody did. Only Christ. He came, deity, and took on flesh. And one of a kind, he never sinned. That's unique. You don't see that every day. So here's the similarities between the two. And another one, it's Revelation 1 and verse 5, that shows the uniqueness of Christ. And from Jesus Christ, who is the faithful witness and the first begotten of the dead. Christ died and rose to never die again. Now, there's nothing unusual in the Scriptures to find individuals that are raised from the dead, but they die again at some point. Lazarus, he died again. The widow's son, she died again. Jairus' daughter, she died again at some point. But Christ is begotten that he never died again. It was no more. Once he was resurrected, that's it. So in that sense, Jesus is unique, one of a kind, the only one to die, to be raised, to never die again. Now, the word begotten is also used to describe us, Christians, in 1 John 5 and verse 1. Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ, is born of God. And everyone who loves him, who begot, also loves him, who is begotten of him. So it speaks there of Christ, who was begotten. And it speaks of us begotten. Because when God said, I'm going to save people, he said, I'm going to save the Christian and the Christian only. That's it. He didn't say, I'm going to save this group and this group and this group. He said, they are special. They are unique. They're one of a kind. Speaking of Christians, and God said, that's the ones I'm going to save. And of course, we have a choice if we want to be, become Christians or not and live as God will want us to live. But we are unique in the eyes of God. We're one of a kind in the eyes of God. That's us, the Christian. And that's who God is going to save. So 1 John 5 and verse 1 speaks of even the Christian as being begotten, one of a kind. Now I want to go and talk about Isaac some more. And I think we're going to see some similarities with how they were both begotten. Genesis 22, 1 and 2. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here am I. Then he said, take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. So God tells Abraham there's going to be a sacrifice, and your son is going to be the sacrifice. Now that doesn't seem right from a human standpoint. Why would God tell Abraham to sacrifice his own son? And one might say, well, Abraham had the faith that he knew that God was going to raise him up. And according to Hebrews 11 verse 19, he did. He had that kind of faith. That's where it says, concluding that God was able to raise him up, even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So Abraham believed this. And he believed this before they went up to the mountain. When God told him to get these items, I'll provide a sacrifice, Abraham believed that before he took the knife and was about to, pierce Isaac through. He knew this in advance, that what God was going to do, that God could raise him from the dead. Abraham knew it in advance. Didn't God know in advance as well, when Christ came to this earth, that when he was sacrificed, that God was going to raise him? God knew it. Christ knew it. He knew it in advance. So there are some similarities between the two. Another reason we know this, that Abraham knew it before going to the mountain, up on the mountain, is Genesis 22, 5. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. We're going up to worship, and we're coming back. He knew he was going to sacrifice Isaac. But he also knew that him and Isaac were coming back down that mountain. He knew that ahead of time. So Abraham had absolute assurance that he was not going to lose his son that day. Absolute. He knew that. And Christ had absolute assurance as well that the Lord was not, his Father was not going to leave him in the grave, in the tomb. He's going to bring him out 3 days later. He knew that. And I think we discussed this Wednesday night a little bit. Isaac knew this as well. Before going up, he knew he was going to be the sacrifice. He knew that. And him and Abraham, maybe in that journey up the mountain, they talked about it and discussed it. And Abraham, the faith that he had, Isaac had that faith as well, knowing that God would raise him if it came down to that. So here we have, again, those similarities between Isaac and Christ as being the begotten. In Genesis 22 and verse 2, there's something interesting here. Then he said, "Take now your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Abraham lived in Beersheba. That's where he lived. That was his home. The mountains that he was going to go to, where God had instructed him, God said, "Go to the land of Moriah." That's where you're going to go, a mountainous range. Once you get there, I will tell you where you're going, what mountain to get on and what mountain to sacrifice Isaac on. He was going to tell him that. So about a 3-day journey from Beersheba to this land of Moriah. Genesis 22 and verse 4, if you look that up, you'll see there that they traveled for 3 days to get there, to get that place. Now, Jerusalem is not a city yet. It hasn't been established whenever Abraham is making his way. It was built, the city was built in the mountains on the land of Moriah. That's where it's located. And it's on the mountainous range there, two mountains it's sort of built upon. And Jerusalem was built on Mount, it's called Gihon and Sion, are the two mountains where it sort of city occupies. And Mount Gihon is more or less the place where a lot of it is located, the city of Jerusalem. Now, is it possible? Now, we don't know this. Is it possible that where Jerusalem was located, the very place that Christ was crucified, is it possible that at that very place is where Isaac was offered by Abraham? Is it possible? Because the land of Moriah is where Jerusalem is located, on these mountains, two of them in particular. Mount Gihon and Sion is where they are. And guess what Mount Gihon is called in the scriptures, what they call it. Well, Luke 23:33, and when they had come to the place called Calvary, that mountain during the time of Christ was called Calvary. It didn't become Calvary after Christ was crucified. It was already called that place, Calvary, as Christ goes there. Many of the scholars, they think that the very place that Isaac was sacrificed or about to be sacrificed is the exact place where you find Calvary, or where Christ was crucified as well. Based on this, he went to the same region. When he got there, he told him where to go on the mountain up there. And we can't prove it. But if you look at some of the similarities here of begotten, unique, between Isaac and Christ, it very well could be. And we can ask one day and find out. But there are those who think that is very possible. Any thought on that one? Similarity there. Now, go in a little bit different direction here. Talk about something that still pertains to Abraham. Back in the 90s, there was a thought in religion, and even within the church in some places, that everything that we do in life is worship. Everything. You can't get away from it. And they want to say all of life is worship, so you got to make sure everything you do is right, and that was being pushed, but you don't hear much of it anymore because of that thought was defeated just by logic going to the Bible. And one place that you go to show that everything that we do in life is not worship. Now, we live in service to God every day, but not every day is worship. You wasn't worshiping before you got here. After you leave here, this morning, you're probably not going to be in worship then. But you're going to be in service to God, living a Christian life before and after you leave here. But look what is said here in Genesis 22 and verse 5. And Abraham said to the young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Abraham had the intention. We're going yonder to worship. Not everything was worship to him. He told these men that were with him, the young man that was there, the donkey, "We're going to go up there and worship, and then we're going to come back down to you." So that shows us that worship is something that we have the intention on doing. Probably this week, you've been thinking, well, Sunday's coming, we'll be going to church. I'm going there intentionally to worship God, to study. That's what we're doing. Now, this isn't worship right here, but here in a few minutes we'll be conducting worship. This is just study we're having now. But there will come a time when we have the intention that we're going to worship. And that's what we'll do. But Abraham shows here that not everything is worship. We don't worship God 24/7. That's not it. There's an element where we come together too, and then there's an element we stop, just as Abraham did so here. David did the same thing. 2 Samuel 12:20. Look at what happens before the child dies. Look what happens after the child dies. So David arose from the ground. This is after the child dies. Washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes and went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Then he went to his own house. And when he requested, they set food before him and he ate. While the child was alive, David was praying, which is a great thing, wonderful thing. He was going to God, pleading with God for the child to live, but the child died. After the child died, he then went into the house of the Lord and worshiped. He was not worshiping before he went in, and after he left, he was not worshiping. He went home and began to eat. So David shows us that worship is something that we do. We make plan on doing. We have the intention of doing it. And it's not just something that we do every day, all the time. It's not worship. But there is service. And that's how we live every day. Romans 12 and verse 1. "I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service." We can do this. We can live daily holy and live acceptable to God. That's just reasonable. We can do that. And that's what God expects. He don't expect us to come to services here on Sunday for a couple of hours, and after we leave, we can go and live any way we want to and do anything we want to do. That's not reasonable. We come here to learn One thing is to learn how to better live the Christian life. That's one thing. That's reasonable. It can be lived. So there's the difference in reasonable service and worship 24/7. Worship is intentional. It just doesn't happen. We make the effort to do so. And then another thing here about Abraham is how some will use Abraham from the standpoint of salvation goes, that what Abraham did was not work. And they'll say we've got to have the faith of Abraham. And it's true, it wasn't Abraham's idea to offer up his son. If Abraham had been sitting at home one night and said, I'm going to show God how much I love him. I'm going to take Isaac up to this mountain and I'm going to sacrifice him. And that'll prove just how much I love the Lord. Isaac would have died. Because that would have been Abraham's. I'm going to show him. I'm going to work my way to God. I'm going to show how much I do by looking at my works. That'd be wrong. But because God told Abraham to do this, it was not Abraham's idea. He was just being obedient. And he operated by faith that God was going to take care of Isaac. And that's where Hebrews 11:17 is speaking about, where it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, there's God tested him, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So there's God testing Abraham. It's not Abraham doing it. And then Genesis 22:18 there, in your seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. He obeyed God's voice. He didn't do it himself. It wasn't his idea. So if we come out and say, I want to show God just how much I love him. I'm going to do this to prove to him how much I love him. That would be wrong. We do what we do because God says, here's what you do. I don't go out here and do these things being it my idea. Let's see what God puts before us to do, and then operating by faith, we do that. Romans 4 brings this out. Also Romans 4:1-5. What then shall we say that Abraham our father was found according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, it was accounted to him for righteousness. Now to him who works, the wages are not counted as grace, but as debt. But to him who does not work, but believes on him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is accounted for righteousness. Some will come to Romans 4, and they'll say that baptism is not necessary because it's something you do. That's where they want to go with this. But it's not my idea. It's not my idea. It's the Lord telling me what to do. Therefore, I'm operating by faith and doing what God said. It's not my idea to come up here and, well, Lord, I think I'm going to be baptized because that's what I want to do. No, it's what the Lord has given for us to do on that. So some will use Romans 4 sort of against baptism, since it's by faith only, when it's not faith only. And we go to James 2:21-24. That's where we find Abraham. Was not Abraham, my father, justified by works when he offered Isaac, his son, on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? The Scripture was fulfilled, saying, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God. You see then that man is justified by works and not by faith only. God told Abraham, here's what you do. Abraham had faith in it. He was obedient to it. There you see he did the right thing. And that's what we do as well. God said, you want to be saved, here's what you do. And we do it, not our idea. We're just being obedient to God, not operating by faith that God will do what he says he will do, and forgiveness of our sins, and save us when that time comes when we do as he says. So a little lesson there on begotten. If you come across a version that doesn't have it in there, I would question that version. Why would they want to take that out?
Just going back to the very first slide this morning, Genus would be the word only, wouldn't it?
Mono, yeah.
So what Greek word would be translated begotten?
I have to look and see. I don't know what the actual Greek word is, but
I think, I've not been able to go do the research on this yet. You know, sometimes King James, they have phrases that are dated.
mhm.
And it might be that the word begotten was just something that was common to that thing in time. We all know when it says only son, it means, we know what it means.
We know what it means.
Yeah. And that may have, say, only begotten son, may have just been their way of expressing yourself at that day in time.
But it's in the Greek. Begotten is in the Greek.
Begotten is in the Greek.
In the Greek.
That's what I was asking you.
Yeah, oh yeah, I see. Yeah,
Genus is only.
yeah.
That's why I just wondered if the word begotten is actually a Greek word.
It is a Greek word. Yeah. All right, next week our meeting starts, and Dunn will have their class and such beginning next week. And look forward to it, and as we all are, making preparation for it. All right. About time for the bell.